Although the Far East, known colloquially as the Orient, has always been a region of mystery and intrigue for the average American and European, Asian immigration from literally every part of the continent has exploded in recent years as the floodgates of migration have seemingly shifted from Latin America to Asia, and it doesn't appear that this trend will stop anytime soon. Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, Indians, Vietnamese, Filipinos, and other Asian groups have all become valuable assets to the American economy and have greatly contributed to the greater American culture and atmosphere, especially in the western half of the United States. Although people of East, South, and Southeast Asian descent make up only around 5% of the country's population currently, this is expected to greatly increase in the coming years, possibly reaching around 9 to 10% in the next 50 years, especially in states like California, where the percentage is already well above this number. It is odd to think that the most densely populated area on the planet lies across a single body of water from the United States, but large-scale immigration from the region hadn't really taken hold until relatively recently. But believe it or not, there was actually a time in American history when it looked like large-scale Asian immigration was just around the corner, and had things gone a bit differently, perhaps East Asians would be the largest racial minority in the US. What a lot of people might find to be a quirk of modern American vernacular is that Americans, regardless of where they're from, when referring to someone's race will use the term Asian strictly to describe people of East or Southeast Asian descent, while in the United Kingdom, people use the term Asian more often than not when referring to people of South Asian or even Middle Eastern origin. Now, obviously, myself and other Americans realize that Asia is much more than just China. Well, most of us do, but the reason we're more comfortable using the term Asian to describe East and Southeast Asians is because they have the longest history of any Asian immigrant group in this country, dating back over 400 years actually. Sounds unlikely? Let me explain. The first Asian immigrant group to be recorded anywhere in the area that is currently administered as the United States would actually be Filipinos from the Spanish-owned Philippines in the late 1500s. A handful of Filipino immigrants actually arrived in the area known as San Luis Obispo County in Southern California in 1587, which of course was then administered by the Spanish Crown under the territory of New Spain. Filipinos would migrate in very small numbers to other parts of the United States that were owned by the Spanish Empire at the time, including San Francisco and Spanish Louisiana. This immigration, however, was very minor in the grand scale of migration to the United States, and it wasn't until the mid-1800s that America began to see major Asian immigration. The mid-1800s brought about many exciting chapters in American history, putting an end to slavery in the United States, the California Gold Rush, and the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, stretching from coast to coast of the continental U.S. The latter two of these three was the catalyst that brought about large-scale immigration from East Asia to the western United States, with the number of ethnic Chinese in the country growing from 4,000 in 1850 to 35,000 in 1860 and 68,000 in 1870. At the time, it seemed that East Asian migration was truly an unstoppable force in many areas of the country, especially California, Washington, Nevada, and Idaho, and for this reason, many of the locals began to fear and resent the prospect of mass Chinese immigration, seeing how they took for themselves many decent-paying jobs at the time, such as miners, railroad workers, and agricultural workers, as well as many Chinese men marrying white and black American women in states that had no laws against interracial marriages. Chinese and other East Asian ethnic groups settled mostly on the West Coast, especially larger Californian cities, the Sierra Nevada, the northern portions of the state of Nevada, and parts of Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. By the 1870s, Nevada had a very large Chinese population at around 9% of the state, or about 5,000 people at the time out of 60,000. In Idaho, Chinese made up almost one-third of the population, or over 4,000 out of a population of 14,000, and in California, Asian groups of all kinds made up almost 1 in every 10 citizens. And keep in mind, this was only 5 years after the end of the American Civil War, and virtually every state outside of this region was divided only into categories of white and black Americans, with small pockets of Native Americans and people of mixed race. So having a large Asian minority in the United States was really unprecedented. This wave of Asian immigration was essentially halted in the year 1882 by a federal law passed by the U.S. government known as the Chinese Exclusion Act, which prohibited immigration of Chinese and pretty much all other Asian groups to the continental United States, although a loophole would later still allow immigration to Alaska and Hawaii. Chinese populations in the previously mentioned states would plummet in the coming decades as the Asian laborers either returned back to China or moved to Alaska or Hawaii, although many did end up staying in California. Chinese and other Asian immigration to the United States wouldn't end up taking off again until the 1960s, which is why out of the 20 million people in the US with Asian ancestry, about 60% of them are foreign-born. Now that we've got some context, this scenario is going to revolve around the possibility that the Chinese Exclusion Act and other federal laws that slowed down immigration, such as the Emergency Quota Act of 1921 or the Immigration Act of 1924, were never passed, and immigration from Asia, mostly East Asian countries, was allowed to grow and flourish unabated. This is going to be very similar to my video on what the US would look like if there was an independent black nation, so realize that I'm not necessarily supporting the concept, simply exploring the possibilities. In this scenario, since the Asian population of the United States is still growing at the same rate it was prior to the immigration acts of the late 1800s and early 1900s, the Chinese population of the West Coast grows exponentially, reaching as high as 1.4 million by the year 1940. As Chinese workers bring with them their wives and families and would probably end up establishing many of their own towns and cities in the same way that German and Scandinavian immigrants did in the real world in this area in the same time period. If the rate of Chinese growth stayed stable, Idaho could have an Asian population of over 30%, Nevada perhaps 20%, and California could possibly be as high as 40%, with most of the majority Asian counties in the continental US being located in the areas with the greatest Chinese concentration in the late 1800s, which would effectively be known as the Asian Belt, a slight parallel to the areas of the United States with the greatest African concentration, located in the southeast, known as the Black Belt. It's unknown if East, Southeast, and South Asians would still be categorized under the same racial category in the US Census, but East Asians would become the largest minority in the United States at over 50 million people. Many major Californian cities such as Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Fresno would all be majority Asian, including South and Southeast Asians that would have probably taken advantage of the opportunity to migrate to the west coast of America as well. Through the generations, these immigrants would have probably completely assimilated into American society, losing their mother tongues and speaking English, perhaps with a unique dialect developing in major Chinese majority cities, and similar to how black Americans began to spread across the country during the early 1900s and the period known as the Great Migration, these Asian Americans would have probably done the same with the Asian communities of places like Texas, Illinois, New York, and New Jersey receiving a huge boost. It's unknown whether the Asian communities of the West Coast could have created their own unique ethnic group in the same way that the various African tribes and ethnicities came together to form the modern Black American in a process known as ethnogenesis. But if they did, their culture would probably be a mix of Chinese, Japanese, and Korean, perhaps with Southeast Asian influence as well. Keep in mind that since the US never puts a cap on immigration or citizenship requirements for any group in this scenario, immigration from nearly all of the surrounding regions would have also greatly increased, with European and Latino immigrants also flooding the country in huge numbers, meaning that the population of the United States today could have been much larger than it is now. We're talking maybe even hundreds of millions of people larger, but that's not exactly what this video is about. Now, because Asian Americans of all kinds are currently some of the richest racial groups in the country after Jewish Americans, their presence could probably be a major boost to their local economies, and California would become the most economically prosperous state in the country, and its population would be astronomically larger than it is now, perhaps even splitting into several smaller states, like has been suggested in our timeline for decades now. How would this affect politics in the states? Asian Americans in the past have overwhelmingly voted for small government up until recently, with the switch occurring in the mid-90s, right around the time Asian immigration was picking up, and although younger Asian Americans vote Democrat at a rate of 3-1, the ratio for older, more established Asian American groups is a bit more balanced. Also, keep in mind that even though Asian Americans have voted for the Democratic candidate in recent presidential elections and local and state elections, Asians actually tend to lean right more often than not, so really we wouldn't be able to know for sure. After all, it doesn't really matter, seeing how this is just a made-up scenario, but it would certainly be very interesting to see the huge impact that mass Asian immigration would have had on the politics, economy, and culture of the United States. Go ahead and let me know your thoughts on Asian American history, whether you would have supported large-scale immigration from Asia or not, and what your thoughts are on this scenario. By the way, guys, my fellow Texans and Americans down in Houston are really getting slammed right now by Hurricane Harvey. Hundreds of thousands of people have gotten their homes flooded, and tens of thousands of people are now homeless. Here in Dallas, we're perfectly safe, although right now we're kind of having a major gas crisis. Like almost every single gas station in my neighborhood has run out of gasoline because all of our oil refineries are in Houston. It's seriously like Mad Max out here. Although I'm just gonna stay in my apartment and keep making videos, so I'm good. I'm gonna go ahead and link a donation page from the Red Cross in the description if you'd like to donate to Hurricane Harvey victims. And by the way, I know I haven't posted on my second channel in a few weeks. I've been pretty busy with moving apartments and starting up university again, but I'll be sure to get another video out by this Saturday. As always, thanks for watching, everyone. This has been Mason, and I'll see you next time.